The world of Alcolu, South Carolina in the spring of 1944 was a quiet, divided place. The small mill town was split in two, one side for white families, the other for black. The railroad tracks didn't just separate neighborhoods, they symbolized the hard line of segregation. The invisible wall that told children where they belonged and what was forbidden. George Jr.'s Stinney Jr. was just 14 years old, small for his age, weighing barely 90 pounds, with hands that looked more suited for holding a slingshot than wielding violence. He was a boy who loved to sketch in the dirt with a stick, who carried his Bible faithfully to church, who helped his father tend the family's modest garden after school. Those who knew George remembered him as a quiet boy, shy and kind. He loved playing marbles with his little sister, Amy, and often helped neighbors carry heavy buckets of water. In the segregated South, where black children were often taught to keep their heads down, George did just that. But beneath the stillness of this small town, the tensions of Jim Crow ran like dry timber waiting for a spark. And in March of 1944, that spark arrived. On March 23rd, two young white girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 8-year-old Mary Emma Thames, set off on their bicycles. They rode through the dirt paths and pine trees, picking wildflowers. As they went, their laughter carrying on the wind. The town knew them as sweet, polite children. But on that day, they never came home. The search began quickly. Families scoured the fields, police questioned neighbors, and fear rippled through Alcolu. By evening, their bicycles were found abandoned near a ditch. And soon after, the bodies of Betty and Mary Emma were discovered in a shallow muddy waterway. Both had suffered terrible blows to the head. A blunt instrument had ended their lives. Panic swept the town. Two white children had been murdered, and in the deep South of the 1940s, suspicion fell almost immediately on the black community. And that's when George's life, his childhood, his future, his very existence was torn away. The next day, while George and his little sister Amy were tending to the family's cow near the railroad tracks, a group of white men approached. Among them were police officers. They questioned George. Witnesses would later say the boys had spoken briefly to Betty and Mary Emma when the girls asked about where to find certain flowers. That simple interaction was enough to mark him. Police seized George and placed him under arrest. His parents were not allowed to be present. He was taken away, accused of murder, while Amy, wide-eyed and terrified, stood helplessly by. For hours, officers interrogated George. There was no lawyer, no parent, no protection, just a scared, underfed 14-year-old boy sitting under the weight of grown white men demanding he confess. The details of that interrogation were never fully recorded, but later reports claimed that George had confessed, though no written or signed statement existed. There was no record of his exact words, no recording, nothing but the word of the police.by that evening. The news had spread. The killer had been caught. George's parents were forced to flee their home under threats of violence. His father was fired from his job at the sawmill. The family, already poor, was now marked as outcasts, and George, he was left to face the machinery of Southern justice alone. George Stinney Jr. was charged with the murders of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames. The speed at which the system moved was astonishing. Within just weeks of his arrest, the trial was scheduled. It was clear from the beginning, this wasn't about justice. It was about appeasing the fury of a segregated community that demanded a scapegoat. George's appointed lawyer was a tax commissioner with no experience in criminal defense. He barely spoke to George before the trial, never investigated the case, and called no witnesses on the boy's behalf. The prosecution's case was chillingly thin. They presented George's so-called confession, a statement that no one had seen, no one had recorded, and no one could prove existed. They claimed George admitted to killing the girls with a railroad spike, but no physical evidence tied him to the crime. There were no fingerprints, no bloodstains, no murder weapon produced in court. The all-white, all-male jury sat in silence as the trial unfolded. Black citizens were not allowed inside the courtroom. Outside, armed guards stood watch, fearing. The mob that gathered was ready to lynch George if the trial did not end quickly. The proceedings lasted barely a day. Witnesses for the prosecution testified to finding the bodies. Doctors described the wounds, but when it came time for the defense, George's lawyer offered nothing. Not a single witness was called. Not even George himself took the stand in his own defense. The jury deliberated for just 10 minutes. 10 minutes to decide the fate of a child. 10 minutes to weigh life and death. The verdict: guilty. The sentence: Death by electric chair. George Stinney Jr., age 14, standing barely 5'1", weighing less than 100 pounds, was sentenced to die. For the next 81 days, George sat in a small cell, awaiting execution. The prison walls must have felt like they were closing in. At night, he cried for his mother. His family was too afraid to visit. White mobs threatened them, forcing them to flee town. George was utterly alone. Imagine it. A child locked in a cell with the knowledge that in just a few weeks he would be strapped to a chair and electrocuted. Other prisoners remembered him as quiet, often praying, holding a small Bible in his hands. He still had the roundness of a boy, the innocence of someone who had only just left childhood behind. And yet, the state of South Carolina prepared to treat him as a hardened killer. On June 16, 1944, George was led to the execution chamber at the South Carolina State Penitentiary in Columbia. He wore an oversized pair of shoes and a Bible clutched under his arm when he entered the room. Witnesses noted how small he looked against the hulking electric chair, a machine built for grown men. His feet couldn't even touch the floor. Prison staff struggled to adjust the straps to fit his tiny body. The mask placed over his face was too large. When the first jolt of electricity surged through him, it slipped off, revealing his tear-streaked face to the witnesses. 3 waves of electricity coursed through George Stinney's body. After the final shock, he was pronounced dead. He was 14 years old, the youngest person executed in America in the 20th century. For decades, George's name faded into the shadows of history. His family lived with the stigma, too afraid to speak out, too poor to fight the system. His siblings carried the weight of knowing their brother had been killed for a crime he did not commit, but whispers remained. Those who looked closely saw how flimsy the evidence had been, how rushed the trial was, how little protection George had received. Legal scholars, activists, and journalists began to revisit the case, slowly pulling the threads of injustice into the light. In 2014, 70 years after George's execution, his case was brought back to court. His siblings testified. They told the story of how George had been with them the entire day, nowhere near the crime scene. Experts examined the records and concluded that his confession was almost certainly coerced. The judge reviewing the case declared what George's family had always known. He had not received a fair trial. His conviction was vacated, though George could never be brought back. The ruling gave his name a measure of justice. The boy who had been executed without evidence, without defense, was finally recognized as a victim, not a murderer. George Stinney's story is more than the tragedy of a life cut short. It is a mirror reflecting the brutal realities of a system poisoned by racism, fear, and injustice. His case has become a symbol of the dangers of rushed trials, of coerced confessions, of executing the innocent. Artists, filmmakers, and activists continue to tell his story, ensuring it is never forgotten. And every year, people gather to remember George, to honor the life that was stolen. His siblings, now elderly, still recall the laughter of their little brother, his shy smile, his gentle spirit. To them, he is not just the boy in the headlines, not just the child executed. He is George, their brother, their blood, their family. To understand George's fate, we have to step back and look at the world of 1940 for South Carolina. Jim Crow laws dictated every part of life. Separate schools, separate water fountains, separate everything. For white children, there was safety, structure, and opportunities. For black children, there was danger lurking at every turn. George grew up in a world where the color of his skin was seen as guilt enough. The death of 2 white girls was more than just a tragedy, it was an outrage, and in the eyes of many white residents, someone black had to pay. That someone became George Stinney Jr., not because of evidence, not because of truth, but because of racism embedded in the very foundation of the justice system. The so-called confession that prosecutors relied on was never written down. It wasn't signed. No notes exist. It was a phantom confession, words placed into George's mouth by men desperate for a conviction. His case forces us to ask difficult questions. How many more children have been silenced by systems designed to condemn them? How many lives have been lost to prejudice and fear? His story is a call to remember, a call to demand better, a call to never let history repeat itself, because George Stinney was more than a headline, more than a statistic. He was a boy, and America killed him.